Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here this morning and to share my experiences with adolescent bariatric surgery. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you all for being here and for taking the time out of your day to listen to my story. And I want to extend a thank you to the American Society for Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery for inviting me to share that story this morning. So first and foremost, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Faith Newsome. I am a recent graduate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I am currently a second-year doctoral student at the University of Florida in the Department of Health Outcomes and Biomedical Informatics, where I work in obesity research. I'm also the founder and president of Oceans Lifestyles Incorporated, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that supports and advocates for adolescents living with obesity. And I'll go into much detail about Oceans a little bit later in the presentation. And finally, I'm an outspoken patient advocate. So that being said, here is an overview of the presentation that I will be giving this morning. I do want to note that it is a little bit different than traditional presentations in the sense that it's a very picture-heavy presentation. And the reason that I went with that format is because I really wanted to give you glimpses into my life growing up. And I figured the best way to do that would be to share different snapshots and memories throughout the years. My goal with this presentation is to be as honest and as vulnerable as possible with you about my experiences as a patient, and particularly my experiences with bariatric surgery at a young age. So throughout this presentation, I'll be sharing my story, how my story relays how teens are different in terms of bariatric surgery. I'll be talking about looking forward, the model that I believe would be best in terms of adolescence and obesity, looking into the future. We'll also be hearing from other teens through my work with Oceans. I have the permission to share some responses to some questions that I asked them anonymously, and I think it's interesting to hear from them because they're a little bit closer to surgery than I am, as I'm 7 years post-op. And then finally, I'll be concluding with some key takeaways that I hope that you all get from this presentation. So first, we're going to start with my story, and I'm going to take you all the way back to the very beginning. So at 23, my mom was very eager to become a first-time mom. It's a little cheesy, but she says the moment that I was born, her world turned right side up. She loves being a mom. She takes it very seriously. And as a first-time mother, like many other first-time parents, she read anything and everything that she could get her hands on. She wanted to follow the rule book very closely of parenthood, if there is one that exists. But she read what she could, she did what she could, and she took her job as being my mom very, very seriously. She noticed from a very young age that my weight would be an issue. Both of my parents recognized that my weight would probably be something that I was going to struggle with. So she would go into appointments with providers and express that concern, and was told that wasn't going to be an issue. People called it baby fat. I started a trend of being in the 99th percentile for my height and weight. And each time she brought it up, she was kind of dismissed. She says that at one point, a provider told her just not to feed me cookies for dinner. So the point of that being that there was very little medical intervention from a young age. And so she was left with my dad kind of to their own devices to figure out how they were going to raise a child living with obesity. I chose these photos in particular to show you that I was a happy kid. There's a picture of a family vacation. And then this is a first day of school picture. So I was a kid with a very strong support system. I had plenty of resources, and I had parents who were fiercely dedicated to my health. And despite these advantages, there were still several moments where I struggled. So the first instance of weight bias that I can remember occurred during these young years in elementary school. There was a day where they brought in student nurses, and these student nurses lined me and my peers up, and they weighed us in front of one another. After they weighed me, they pulled me to the side and took me into a separate room, And while my peers continued on with their day, I received a lecture about how I need to start taking my weight seriously. And I remember them saying, if you don't start taking your weight seriously, you'll be putting yourself at risk for high blood pressure and diabetes. Just a friendly reminder that I was in elementary school, so I didn't fully understand what any of those words meant, but I recognized in that moment that I was being singled out because of my weight, and that these people were making a lot of assumptions about me based on that number that they had just seen on the scale. So I say that they made assumptions because they had no idea what great lengths my parents were going to. My mom was shopping at specialty stores to find foods without added preservatives or added sugars. For birthday parties, she would make special treats for me so that I could have treats with my friends, but without all the added sugar. I remember packing snacks for sleepovers. She was going to great lengths, and so they kind of dismissed that with that assumption that they were making, I feel like. Another situation that happened during these early years is that I started to skip field day. If you're unfamiliar with field day, it's usually every kid's favorite day because we got to get out of the classroom, go out to the big soccer field, and we just played games all day. And the reason that this was an issue for me was because the kids on my team were not super excited when I was assigned to their team. So I would try my best. I would try my hardest to try to win over my peers and show them that I could be a valuable member of the team. But the reality was that I was slower and a little bit not as athletic as my peers. And for those reasons, we did typically lose. And my mom, seeing how much this impacted me, eventually allowed me to start to skip those field days. It was either during these early years or during my middle school years, but I also briefly joined a church league basketball team, and I was an asset because of my height, so I could stand in the middle of the court, hold my hands above my head, and grab the ball from just about anywhere, but I was not as fast as the other kids in terms of running up and down the court, so my coaches didn't play me as much as I would have liked to play. So everywhere I turned, I was kind of experiencing rejection based on my weight. I tried calorie restriction and physical activity to no avail. So as I mentioned, in terms of medical intervention, my mom and my dad weren't receiving a lot of support from providers. So they were left to their own devices, and that typically resulted in commercial programs like Slim Fast, Paleo, Atkins, South Beach, Weight Watchers, you name it. I was trying it. And so experiencing that failure, took me into middle school. So it requires a lot of courage to show your middle school photos to a bunch of people on a Friday morning, but here we are. I've grown up in the time of mobile phones, so luckily each step of my journey has been documented, including this blonde hair phase, which I've pictured here. In middle school, the social ostracizing that I mentioned occurred during my early years also continued. And despite continued attempts at calorie restriction and physical activity, I continued to gain weight. So continued with those commercial programs, even tried other things like commercial products. I remember there was a certain kind of bar that if you ate it before your meal, it was supposed to fill you up, so you ate less at your meal. I remember doing P90X, which was a physical activity program. So everything we could get our hands on, we were trying. But alas, I continued to gain weight. And it was at this age as well that I I began to experience health problems. So I started to experience high blood pressure, and I developed a brown dark ring around my neck indicating insulin resistance. And I also began showing signs of depression at this age as well. So I mentioned a few instances in my early years where social ostracizing occurred, and that did unfortunately follow me into middle school. And there was a boy who bullied me in my math class, and that bullying began by bunching up paper balls and throwing those at me during class. And because I grew up in the age of cell phones, eventually I couldn't escape that bullying. Once I left school, he would call me on the phone. And I remember one instance, he told me, "What's your phone number? Step on the scale. That'll tell me." He called me a whale and continued the disparaging comments via phone after school was ended. So I would like to reiterate too that these are ill-intentioned people making these comments, but I also had comments from well-intentioned friends as well. So in particular, I remember being at a sleepover one time with one of my closest friends, and I was disclosing to her the difficulties that I was facing with my weight. And she said, if you just wanted it bad enough, you could lose the weight. And in that moment, she thought that she was being motivating and she thought that she had my best interests in mind. But all I remember in that moment is shutting down, saying I was tired, and I went to bed, my eyes stinging with tears and a huge lump in my throat, and I felt like a failure. So at this point, I did transfer schools due to that bullying that I experienced, and started at a new high school. So this is the before time. So my freshman and sophomore years were the time prior to my bariatric surgery. I chose these photos because they again show that despite some of these adversities I was facing, I was a happy kid. And the number one thing I hope you take away from this slide is that a lot of things change in the before and after photos that I'm about to show you. But one thing that didn't change is my smile and my personality. I would say more so. I felt more comfortable and confident, and people around me treated me differently. So the summer after my sophomore year of high school, I underwent Roux-en-Y gastric bypass at Duke Children's Hospital. So the decision to have that procedure happened after an instance watching my brother compete in a science Olympiad tournament. So I have several family members who have had bariatric surgery, including both of my parents and an aunt and an uncle. And so I kind of knew what it looked like, and I figured that it would be an option for me. I just thought I would have to wait until I was older. And so my mom approached me one night and said, we found a program at Duke. If you want to go, we'll go. If you don't, we won't talk about it again. And so in that moment, I told her I wanted some time to think. I knew that it was a big decision, and I wasn't quite ready to say yes. A few weeks later, we were at that Science Olympiad tournament in an older gymnasium. I say older because the seats were built in the 1970s, and so they were a little more narrow than seats now. And I remember sitting there and the sides of the chair pushing painfully into my thighs, and it was just another reminder that you have tried everything, you have done everything that you have the capability to do. This is going to require some serious intervention that you need help with. And so in that moment, I looked at her and said, I would like to start the process. So from that point on, I started taking a day off of school. My mom had to take the day off of work. The clinic was about an hour and 15 minutes from our house. So I started going for my visits with the pediatrician, the nutritionist, dietitian, and the licensed clinical social worker. Eventually, I was referred to the Bariatric Center where I underwent my preoperative tests and underwent a psychological evaluation, and then my surgery was scheduled. So I had surgery that summer. I think it was June or July. I'm pretty sure it was June. We're coming up on 7 years post-op. And by August, I was on the school's tennis team, which you can see a photo of here. My experiences at prom were much different, I'm sure, and I'll talk about that a little bit in greater detail later on. Up here is a photo from our senior games, which is another day kind of similar to field day where we were just participating in physical activity all day and got to be out of the classroom. And so that was a totally different experience than the one that I had in elementary school. And I just started to feel really comfortable and confident in my body because finally we were on the same page. So for years, I was mad at my body for not responding to the eat less, move more narrative that I was consistently being fed. And I internalized that and I was angry. And so at this point, when I finally received the intensive care that I needed for my severe case of obesity, me and my body began to agree with one another and to be on the same page. So this comfortability and confidence translated to my time in college at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've mentioned before that my family struggled for years to find appropriate pediatric obesity treatment, and I was convicted by the idea that we were not the only family that was struggling. I remember sitting in one of my appointments, and I knew that I wanted to go into something related to obesity professionally. It confused me that there were so many people walking around with this condition or that struggled with their weight. And I had, at 16, I wondered, what do we not know about this? How can I help? So when I went to college, I knew I wanted to work in research. for no other reason than I wanted to understand obesity and I wanted to contribute to the research on obesity. So I dedicated my time in undergrad a lot to learning and reading more about obesity. So for every assignment where professors allowed us to choose our own topics, I always related the course material concepts back to obesity. I had a childhood development course where we had to do a book analysis, and I picked a children's book related to healthy eating and things like that, and consistently related things back to obesity time and time again for these class projects. In addition to the classwork that I was doing, I also participated in research. During the academic year, I worked in an eating disorder lab, and during the summers, I worked on obesity research projects with Duke during summer internships. It was also through those internships with Duke that I founded Oceans, and I will discuss in more detail later on the premise of Oceans and why I was so called to work on a project like that. As you can see here, I ran 5Ks with my friends. That was something that I was excited to do and felt comfortable and confident in my body doing those kinds of things. I tried rock climbing once, wasn't as great at it, but I had the comfortability and confidence to try, and that made all the difference. It was also during my college years that I had the opportunity to go to an Obesity Action Coalition conference. And that was eye-opening because all of a sudden I was surrounded by people who got me, who understood my experiences and knew what it was like to live with obesity. So that was particularly an eye-opening and exciting experience for me as well. Continuing the trend of feeling deeply called to research, I am now a second-year doctoral student at the University of Florida. Again, my degree is in medical sciences with a concentration in health outcomes and implementation sciences. My research interests include adolescent bariatric surgery patients and programs and the implementation of evidence-based treatments for obesity in pediatric populations. So you can see here a photo from my first year. Was a little bit of an interesting one. My family, who was sad to see me go from North Carolina, was very supportive in the move, however, and excitedly dropped me off. And then this paper down here, I've just given you an example of. This is a great example of my interests in implementation sciences and how do we take evidence-based treatments for pediatric populations for obesity and make sure that they can benefit the most kids possible. So I've talked to you a little bit about my story and how we got here. I'd like to revisit that story and explain to you how teens and children are different, particularly in terms of bariatric surgery. So up until now, I've painted a really rosy picture of my experiences with adolescent bariatric surgery. I did explain that I experienced some social isolation, but I'd like to be a little bit more vulnerable and share with you the parts of bariatric surgery that were difficult and that impacted my experience as I was going through it at a younger age. So there are a few subtle differences in these photos. I shared some of these with you earlier in the presentation, but there's differences between myself and my peers in these photos. So the one on the left is obviously very prior to my bariatric surgery. I am the child in orange. That is my brother in the middle, and that is a childhood friend to the most left in the white shirt. And then the picture on the right is the picture that I showed you earlier from our senior games. So on the left, this is just some day in elementary school that was particularly special. They were giving out pizza and sodas. And so you'll notice here, again, very subtle difference. Probably wouldn't think anything of it, but you'll notice my brother and my brother was probably given a Diet Pepsi as well, just so I didn't feel too left out. But you'll notice we're both drinking Diet Pepsis and my friend is drinking a regular Pepsi. And I know that that is a very subtle, very minor difference that might seem trivial at first, but my comparison to my peers was obviously very important as I was growing up and developing my sense of self-identity. And eventually those moments add up. So this was not the only moment that I was having to do something different from my peers. This was one of many where I was worried about my weight in this matter. So I would take sugar-free candy to sleepovers. Again, my mom baked special treats that were healthier versions so that I could still participate and have sweet treats with my friends. So again, these eventually add up to where you feel different from your peers and you don't have the vocabulary to understand why. Because again, the societal perception of obesity is that it's a moral failing, that it's eat less, move more. So you feel that it's your fault. So again, all of these instances happening that you know are happening because of your weight begin to feel like your fault, and that really weighs on you as you're growing up. The picture on the right is from senior games. So this was another instance after my bariatric surgery where there was a parallel between my childhood self and my post-bariatric self. And so there was a little bit of, I was a little naive in thinking that after my surgery, there was going to be a moment where I could be more like my friends and wouldn't have to be thinking about my weight. That is obviously not the case. I knew that having the surgery, that was a huge decision that I was making with implications in terms of future behaviors and habits that I was going to have to adhere to, like my vitamin intake and things like that. But this moment exemplifies that I didn't fully understand that I was still going to be different, and my weight was always going to be something that I had to consider that my friends didn't always have to. So in this photo, they were handing out hamburgers, hot dogs, chips, soda. It was a part of the senior games thing, and what I've outlined here is that is my Tupperware container and my water bottle. So I packed my lunch that day, probably a salad or something protein heavy with a vegetable. And so while everybody else was lining up to go get hot dogs and hamburgers, I was unpacking my lunch and having salad that day, which again, I know looking back as a 23-year-old woman that was perfectly fine. But in that instance, it just reminds you that you're different from your peers and that this is something that you're going to be living with for the rest of your life. I shared one of these photos with you earlier as well, and both of these photos are from prom. Just in case anyone's unfamiliar with prom, it's a big event that happens typically for juniors and seniors in high school, where you get to dress up and go with your friends, and you get dinner, and then you go dance. It's just a really good time. Both of these photos are from my junior and senior year. So the left in the green dress, that was approximately 12 months after my surgery, and the one in the red dress was approximately 24 months after my surgery. So this was another reminder that my weight was always going to be something that I had to consider. And this moment in the red dress was kind of a weight maintenance moment. So up until this point in my life, I had only been losing weight or gaining weight. There was never a stage where I was actively maintaining. So I had gotten over the first year of surgery where the weight was kind of falling off easily, and we were entering into a weight maintenance phase. And full transparency, I very much struggled with that. So these photos look very happy, but what you're not seeing is that a few moments before the picture in that red dress was taken, I was getting ready, full face of makeup, hair done. My mom was standing behind me getting ready to zip up the dress, and she said, "It's not going to fit." And I wish I could communicate to you the amount of panic that my high school senior self had. And I remember my eyes were burning because I was about to cry, but I had makeup on, and my friends were waiting outside to take pictures, and my date was waiting to take pictures. And my mom goes, "You could wear your dress from last year," referring to the green dress, which would have fit. And again, looking back as a 23-year-old woman, that was a perfectly viable solution. But in that moment, that was going to be the end of the world. I was going to have to wear the same dress to prom 2 years in a row. And so I sucked in with all my might. She managed to get it zipped. I think that there's a split in that dress where I had moved wrong or pushed it too far and it had ripped. And so I spent the rest of the night with that reminder of my body pushing out against that dress, that your weight is always going to be something that you have to consider. And not everybody's always going to understand. So I spent that night feeling like a failure, again, in terms of my weight journey, and this was post-bariatric surgery. And again, I just want to reiterate that these might not seem like a big deal, but without fully understanding obesity as a chronic, relentless disease, I felt like I had failed. And in that moment as a teenager, prom was the most important moment. I knew I had a future. I knew that this surgery was going to have implications for me lifelong. But in this moment, I just didn't want to have to think about my weight. And it was something I had to think about. Finally, another lesson learned is I want to reiterate the complexities of obesity and how it feels to live that experience as an adolescent. So these photos all detail my journey through bariatric surgery. This photo right here with my mom is from after my surgery. We were walking a lap around the floor of the hospital to avoid blood clotting in my legs. I don't remember if this picture of getting blood drawn was before or after. I think it was before, but I just remember lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of blood draws. And then this photo of me in the blue striped shirt is from my first post-operative appointment, and I think I had lost something like 10 to 18 pounds. I remember being in the double-digit range, and I was just so surprised and shocked, and you can see my smile there that we're finally getting somewhere. And so this is all normal to me because this was my experience. But I want to reiterate that while I was going to these appointments, my friends were at the movies or at the mall or with other friends and with family and doing all of these kinds of things. So like other chronic conditions, I was dealing with medical issues in a manner that my friends didn't fully understand. And again, I did not have the vocabulary to understand my obesity as a medical condition and not a moral failing. So sometimes these sacrifices, although I made them because I knew I was doing something positive for my health, sometimes they felt like punishments for a body that wasn't conforming to what I thought it was supposed to in terms of weight loss. So I've talked a little bit about how teens are different and the different experiences that I had with my bariatric surgery. As an adolescent, I'd like to talk more to you about a model that I believe helps us move forward and to look forward in terms of adolescent bariatric surgery care. So I fully believe in empowering adolescents in a multitude of ways, and that is the foundation of Oceans. So Oceans, again, is the 501c3 nonprofit that I founded during my undergraduate years. And the reason that Oceans was so important to me is because despite the fact that I was very privileged in having access to high quality care, I still felt isolated. So during those moments in the bariatric clinic, I was consistently surrounded by adults who were having very different experiences than the one that I was having. So I kept my questions about high school lunches and the transition to college and all of that to myself. And I wanted to create a space where teens could ask those questions. So the underlying model kind of under Oceans is to empower adolescents through 3 different avenues. So first, we want to empower them through themselves. We want to empower them through their communities, and we want to empower them through their society. And the reason I think that empowering is so critical, particularly for adolescents, and particularly in the adolescent bariatric space, is that they are fully aware of decisions that they're making and they know the health implications that they have. And so we need to empower them to feel comfortable and confident making those decisions and provide them with the resources that they need to succeed. So I'll explain to you a little bit about how Oceans operates under this model. So the first way we empower them through themselves is through monthly socials. And so these occur via Zoom. I will admit we had trouble with the adoption of this with our teens at the beginning. COVID, though, everyone's become more familiar with video conferencing platforms. And so we've had a lot easier time getting teens on and involved and engaged. So much so that we went from meeting once a month to they've now requested meeting twice a month. So we have socials twice a month, every other weekend. And the photos that I've included here are from one of our participants was in the preoperative phase, and what she really wanted to do with us was to cook a recipe. So I had her send me the resources that she had gotten from her nutrition team at the clinic. And she picked which recipe she wanted to make. I sent out the ingredients list. Everybody bought the ingredients, and we all cooked together one weekend and talked about the preoperative phase, the meals. And we talked about life while we were cooking. We talked about everything while we were cooking. It was just a place to hang out, but it was so that she didn't have to do it alone. So we have a curriculum for these socials. The first 3 socials are mapped out, but after that, we kind of leave it up to them about what they want to talk about. So since then, we've had them just request to talk about life and to get to know each other, and they text each other about their experiences. And it's just a place for them to connect as patients together to talk about their experiences. So that is the way that we empower them through themselves. Second, we aim to empower them through their communities. And the reason that this is important is because we want to raise awareness, and we want to talk about, we want to raise awareness through raising money and funds to support these endeavors that institutions are making. So this is a photo of the promotional materials from our annual fundraiser last year. We did a virtual activity day because we have kids from Ocean's partners with clinics in both Carolinas and Florida, so we have kids kind of spread out. So in order for everyone to participate, we did something virtual that you could do independently and then tag on social media. And the money from this annual fundraiser goes towards the Change is Made in Waves Fund. And so this fund is application-based, and individuals who are working on projects, research projects, or organizational projects that aim to focus specifically on adolescents and obesity are eligible for the fund. Finally, we want to empower adolescents through their society. So I've mentioned several times in this presentation that there's a very negative societal view of obesity, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. And so the point of these activities are to increase awareness by telling our stories, by mentioning the fact that we exist, and we also work on some policy-based advocacy projects as well. So what I've screenshotted here is the Vice President of Oceans, Emily Robinson, and I had the opportunity to share our stories on Ted Kyle's Conscious Health blog. And so our hope with that was that we now had resources that we could provide to teens to say, here, look, somebody gets it, somebody knows what's going on. And then we also had a brief mention in the New York Times about our organization as well. So we really want to raise awareness about adolescents and obesity specifically because they're a different age group and they have different unique needs, as we've mentioned before, than adults or children in terms of obesity interventions. So those are all the kinds of activities that Ocean works in, and how I've taken the lessons that I've learned from my bariatric surgery and tried to implement them into an organization to help teenagers struggling with the same issues that I was. Finally, before we get to conclusions, I wanted to take a moment to share with you some quotes from other teenagers who are adolescent bariatric surgery patients and who have lived with obesity. So these are all shared with permission anonymously from participants in the Oceans program, but I really think it was eye-opening to hear their responses. As I've mentioned, I'm 7 years post-op, so I'm a little bit farther along. One of them actually called me their elder, which made me feel a little old. But the reason I think that their insights are valuable is because they're closer to that age, that they're having it, and that they're right there in the post-operative or preoperative phase and are living through the thick of it every single day. So first I asked them what they wish they had known. And I thought their responses were interesting. So they mentioned how uncomfortable it would be right after. And I believe that participant was referring to gas pains that she was having that she could feel throughout her body. Another participant mentioned how big the vitamins would be afterwards, which I thought was interesting. And I actually remember looking back, looking at that big multivitamin. I was like, whoa. So I thought that was interesting that she brought that up, and I resonated with that in my experience as well. And then interesting, she also mentioned how fast the weight drops off as something they had wished that they had known prior to surgery. Next, I asked them, what advice would you give to another teen who is going to undergo adolescent bariatric surgery? The first one, I think, is getting at some of the lessons that I've mentioned earlier in my presentation. They said, try to forget about your old life. It's a start of new habits and a new life. And I thought that that was a really powerful example of you are leaving behind a lot of old habits and old ways that you interacted with your body and with others, and you're coming into a new life, and it's a beautiful new life, and it's a great new life. And I and they are so thankful for the opportunity that adolescent bariatric surgery has offered, but it's a difficult transition. The second statement that they said was to do your own research. Don't let the doctor tell you everything. Educate yourself about the surgery and different stages after surgery. And the reason that I wanted to point this out is because I think this speaks to potentially weight-biased interventions in the past, or potential conversations that they've had with healthcare providers in the past. So we know that weight bias is prevalent, even in healthcare providers. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the advice that a provider gave my parents whenever I was younger was not to feed me cookies for dinner, which is not very helpful in terms of medical interventions for pediatric obesity. So that being said, I think this speaks to potentially a barrier that adolescents may experience at this age with their healthcare providers. It might be easier to want to do everything by yourself, and it might be that they have had the experience that they needed to be looking up everything by themselves, that they needed to be doing their own research, and that it was very self-directed weight loss attempts. And so for that reason, I wanted to put this up just as a reminder that these adolescents have operated oftentimes throughout their entire life with the world having obesity, and that is a very unique experience. It's a different experience, and it can lead to a lot of wounds and scars and fear about interacting regarding these matters. So I wanted to bring that up as I thought that was a very powerful statement. Finally, I asked them if they had any additional reflections, and I really liked this quote. They said, "This surgery has lifted a weight off me, and I feel a lot better about myself." So I think that's a really powerful statement because I believe that they were referring to weight both physically and metaphorically in terms of I can relate to this experience in terms of after years of weight loss attempts and feeling constantly at war with my body and not understanding why I was eating less and moving more and it wasn't working. Finally having this intense medical intervention, which is what is needed for severe cases of obesity, was really, really powerful and eye-opening. And so I thought that was a great quote to end with from them. Finally, I'd like to end with some conclusion and takeaway points that I hope you leave this presentation with. First and foremost, teens have unique needs that are valid and should be tailored to with the correct educational materials. So as I mentioned, I had a lot of experiences with adults during my bariatric time with the clinic. And so I think that that's totally understandable, but there are certain things that teenagers are going through that adults might not be. For example, prom or consistently comparing yourself to your peers in a way that adults don't necessarily do. So that's the first and foremost. That's what I hope you take from this presentation. Second is understanding obesity as a complex chronic disease. So I mentioned in the presentation several times that solid understanding of obesity as a disease did not occur for me until I was much older after my bariatric surgery. So I didn't conceptualize obesity as something that I was going to live with every single day of my life, but I did recognize that the surgery would impact me in a way that was going to impact me every single day of my life. So I just didn't have the vocabulary to understand obesity as a chronic condition that was going to be something that I had to be aware of for every single day for the rest of my life. And that by having surgery, I was actually thinking more about my weight and how I was managing it than I did in the past. So I think that is another particularly important lesson. Third is that teens should be empowered. That's something that I feel really strongly about. Teens should be in a collaborative relationship with their parents and with their providers to determine the best treatment option for them. In terms of obesity, and if that's bariatric surgery, again, they should be very active participants in their care. And again, just a collaborative relationship between providers and teens is what I think is necessary. And then finally, teens need support from other teens. So it's a very isolating journey to live with obesity and to decide that bariatric surgery is the right option for you because it's an intense intervention. And so I think it's super important that we connect teens with one another in terms of connecting those who are having or undergoing bariatric surgery. I think that's very important. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. I'd like to end this presentation by acknowledging the several privileges that I had as part of my journey. I had virtually no issue obtaining insurance coverage when over half of adolescents are denied, and I was within driving distance of a multidisciplinary pediatric obesity clinic, which is not the case for several adolescents living with severe cases of obesity. Access is an issue. Severe obesity impacts adolescents of diverse racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So ensuring access to intense interventions like bariatric surgery, if adolescents feel like that is what is the best for them, is of the utmost importance. And the reason that I feel that way is we need to ensure access to all of the teenagers who are experiencing the same stigma and isolation that I did, and so that they can grow up and feel empowered and to feel comfortable sharing their stories. And who knows, they might even grow up to be the next obesity researchers and healthcare providers themselves. But most of all, they should grow up to be able to be whoever they want to be comfortably and confidently, and bariatric surgery gives them that option. My story right now is unique in terms of the fact that I had access to this high quality, effective treatment option, but it shouldn't be unique. And I hope in the future that I am just one of many people who feel comfortable and confident sharing my story and my experiences and having access to adolescent bariatric surgery. So again, thank you all for your time and consideration. You can find me on Twitter at my handle, which I've listed here. I've also included my email address, so feel free to email any follow-up questions you might have about any part of my presentation. And if you're interested in support groups for your adolescents, I've also included oceanslifestyles.com, which is our website, or you can contact me at my email address. Thank you again so much for taking the time to listen to my story. And I hope that by sharing it, I have explained a little bit more about what it's like to have surgery at this age. And I hope that we can increase access and that we can help the most amount of kids possible. Thank you again.